start, we acknowledge that the Pragmatic Trials Training Program's coordinating team's offices, located in London, Ontario, are on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and the vital contributors of our society. We also recognize that our work is carried out on the traditional territories of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples from coast to coast, and we are thankful that we are able to work and collaborate on these lands. I'm very fortunate to have two wonderful grandmothers who have been my guides through the journey we've been on the last year and a half. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank our knowledge keepers, Helen Satie and Dr. Mary Wilson, for joining us today. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and they're also going to open today's session with a smudge ceremony.
Mhm.
Helen?
Yeah. Tansenin bonjour. Esi kwe Nadishna Kaz, Makwa Nidudem, Saskatchewan, Shugo Winnipeg, Nudunji. And in English, my name is Helen Robinson Satie, and I introduced myself to you in my language, which is Anishinaabe. And my spirit name that I carry, Clan Woman, and I'm from the Bear Clan. And also, my home community is called the Scotchanoong. It's where the river flows into the lake, and in English, it's Dauphin River here in the Interlake area of Manitoba. And I live, work, and play and pray here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, the ancestral land of my people, the Anishinaabe. And I'm very honored to be here this morning. And this morning, well, it's morning. I guess it's afternoon now. I'm uh, I'm I'm actually burning sage, but this sage I'm burning is from the West Coast. My oldest son lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I'm very lonesome for him. I get
Oh.
lonesome for him every once in a while, and so I'm burning this sage here. It comes like this. Wait, like that. It's mountain sage. It's got a different smell, so. When I see this sage, it reminds me of him. And actually, this morning I actually did. This is my second time praying today, but this morning I was at a conference and went and did an opening for them, and I was feeling lonesome for my son and our premier Wab Canoe, who is also an Anishinaabe. He's from Treaty 3 territory though, and he was asking me about my sons, and so I thought that was pretty. I thought that was pretty cool that he asked me about my son because he said I was just thinking about him, feeling lonely for him, and he said, "Oh, he said you got such nice boys." He said, "I'm really honored to know them." So that's why I want to burn this mountain sage for us today, for our beautiful time that we'll be spending with our sister here, Leona. Miigwech, and there's grandmother Mary. Go ahead, Mary.
Well, good morning. So my name is Ogamake Pematit Hiskanawa, and I am kin to the wolf, and I am born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I'm so honored to be a part of the smudge ceremony as well. I just finished smudging a whole bunch of children. Actually, it was really lovely to do before I met with you, and it's going to be wonderful to spend some time with you and grandmother Leona Starr. And wow, what a wonderful way to start. So she's smudging her eyes to see good things, her ears to hear good things, her mouth to speak good things, her aura, her spirit, her mind, her body. And it's her own personal time for just a little thank you to Creator for life and for goodness, or however it is that you pray in your own way. But that smudge also takes the free radicals out of the air, just to let you know it truly is medicine, and it is a woman's medicine. So I thank you so much for sharing that with us, Helen, grandmother Helen, and I want to start the day in a good way. So with that, Creator, thank you for blessing us with the beautiful medicine you have. Hi, hi.
Thank you so much, both of you. I so appreciate you doing that and blessing this session, this third session. It's my privilege today to introduce our guest speaker. Her name is Leona Starr, and she is a Cree from Thunder Child First Nation in Saskatchewan in Treaty 6 territory. She studied at the First Nations University of Canada, worked for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and is currently Director of Research for the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba. Leona is a strong advocate for First Nations self-determination and research, which is grounded in the First Nations principles of OCAP. She follows the First Nations Regional Health Survey model and framework to ensure the highest standards of First Nations research ethics are upheld. And it's our honor and delight to have you here today, Leona. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. It's Patty. And thank you for that beautiful opening, Helen and Mary. I'm really honored and thankful to be here with you today. And thank you for the invitation and taking the time to learn a bit more about the First Nations principles of OCAP. I won't go into too much detail because I think the previous speakers kind of really covered, I guess, what those principles really mean and why they were created. Today, I'm just going to share a bit more about how we've taken the next step in terms of telling our own stories through data and how OCAP is inherently connected to all of those pieces. I'm going to share my screen. Am I able to share my screen?
I think so.
Okay.
And if you can't, Sierra is here and she'll fix that if it's a problem.
Okay, I think I got it.
Right.
Design slideshow. I'm beginning. Okay. So, Danse, it's good to help you. My name is Leona Starr. As Linda introduced me, I come from Thorntrell First Nation, Treaty 6 territory. It's where I grew up and where I continue to live. I currently work virtually for the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba. And today I'm going to be sharing a bit of some of the work we've done in relation to data and information and how we've asserted data sovereignty and utilized the principles of OCAP as a tool towards our own self-determination as it applies to research. I first want to share about how we've always been sovereign as nations. We've always had our own teachings. We've always had our own ceremonies and our own origin stories. For us as Nehewa, Anishinaabe, the Indigenous people of these lands and territories, from our understanding and our own teachings, we come from the stars. We've each been placed here for a purpose until that time where we fulfill our purpose, and then we go back to back to that beautiful place in the stars. And prior to contact, we've always had our own laws and systems that governed ourselves and governed our relationships to one another and taught us about our roles and responsibilities. I want to talk briefly about the relationship that we have with the Crown, and the relationship and the responsibilities that we have to one another, and how these agreements came to be, as it based on an agreement to share these lands and territories, and in exchange for treaty annuity payments and certain rights as it applies to hunting, trapping, and that sustaining that life that we've always had prior to contact. It was never about giving up those rights to in exchange for certain benefits, including specifically the Treaty 6 Medicine Clause, which is the treaty right to health. And when we talk about the treaty right to health, it's about the treaty right to our own well-being, the right to be ourselves, the right to practice our own medicines, the right to heal ourselves in our own way, the way we've always done. That was never intended. We never gave that up. Those rights were interrupted due to colonization. And those agreements that were made between First Nations people and the Crown, those treaties were meant to sustain us for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. So as long as we, as First Nations, exist, these treaties also exist, and those responsibilities to our lands and territories and the animals that reside within our territories, we also have responsibilities to them. As First Nations Métis people, we also have certain rights that are entrenched within the Canadian Constitution, specifically First Nations. So much so that the federal government has a responsibility for us Indians and lands reserved for us as Indians under Section 35. It's where the 1982 Constitution Act states that the existing treaty and Aboriginal rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. That's something that is not talked about often enough. And that's why these treaties exist. And that's why, as Indigenous people, we have certain rights that are protected within the Canadian Constitution. One of the most harmful acts that has impacted us and continues to impact us is the Indian Act of 1876, which was created essentially to assimilate us Indians into the overall Canadian construct. One of the treaty right to education, when we talked about the treaties, this was one of the ways that the federal government implemented that treaty right to education, it established the Indian residential schools, where up to 150,000 of our First Nations Inuit Métis children were apprehended and forced to attend these schools. And the goal was not necessarily to educate our children, but it was to kill the Indian and save the child. Effectively removed our children from our families, where there was no more children in our nations. Can you imagine a time where there was no children in any community across Canada? I just want to let you sit with that for a moment. In those schools, in those institutions, our children and our families were not able to speak their language. They were punished harshly for even trying to speak their language or to even practice their culture or who they were. There was ongoing experimentation, again, without consent. And I'll circle back to that consent piece later on in my presentation. Another harmful interruption to our nations was the establishment of tuberculosis sanatoriums. Our people thought about those TB hospitals almost like the government fulfilling their promise to the treaty right to health. There was Indian hospitals that were established across Canada, and a lot of them were eventually turned into TB sanatoriums. And really, it wasn't necessarily the prevention of disease, more it was the containment of illness. It was the containment of illness of Indians within these institutions called Indian hospitals, where, again, children and adults were sent away, and most of them never returned, nor did their families know where they went, because they were sent all across Canada for treatment. Again, those children and families were also experimented on without consent. Fast forward to the 1950s, to 1980s where another generation of children were stolen, called them the stolen generation or the 60s scoop, where an estimation of 20,000 plus Indigenous children were taken and placed into foster care all across the United States and Canada. And some are still struggling to find their way back to their families and their home territories. That continuation of the apprehension of our children still continues today within the current child welfare system, where we have even more children who are in the child welfare system today than there ever was within the Indian residential school system. The reason why I needed to talk about that initially before I started talking about being able to be the need to be seen within data sets is incredibly important, because without being seen in data sets um, within systems, then we never really know what the challenges are, what the overall health outcomes are, and what it is, what's negatively impacting our health outcomes. And those systems that I talked about before, the IRS, the TB sanatoriums, the continued apprehension of our children, those are all underlying. They're all underlying, and they negatively impact our overall health and well-being. This is why First Nations are in the state we are in today, where we see our health outcomes, almost every single type of chronic disease and illness. We have the highest rates in terms of diabetes, in terms of a lot of the other challenges that we see within healthcare systems. This is why our children continue to be removed from their homes all across. Within Manitoba, I'm going to kind of speak about our region now. Within Manitoba, we have 63 First Nations. About over half of them still reside on reserve, which is contrary to some of the other regions where a good majority of First Nations reside off reserve. Within Manitoba, we have 5 distinct nations. And that's really important to understand, because when you're undertaking research or you're looking at certain data sets, it's important to understand what the cultural origins of those nations are, how each of those distinct nations, what makes them unique, what makes them who they are. So I'll be talking about the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, the Innu, Dakota, and Dene. So there's been numerous reports that have talked about the state of Indigenous health and well-being ever since the 1990s, when the RCAP report came out, all the way to the AGI report released in 1999. The TRC calls to action, and the report that was released in 2015, and the most recent report on the inquiry to MMIWG in 2019. Going back specifically to the call to action number 19, where it really called on the government and institutions to establish measurable goals to identify and to close those gaps in the health outcomes between all other Canadians and Indigenous people. And they list pretty much your standard indicators, which doesn't necessarily create space for that. It doesn't give recognition to any type of cultural foundation in terms of what makes us who we are as Indigenous people. It doesn't focus on wellness. Essentially, identifying and measuring illness and how close we are to death than how close we are to living the life we're meant to be. We're meant to live as Indigenous people. Bit of background in terms of how we came to be as an organization, how we originated from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, which is a political entity representing all First Nations within Manitoba. And their mandate is really to protect and strengthen those treaty and inherent rights that I spoke about earlier on, and to improve upon the lives of First Nations people through improving their socioeconomic conditions. We are one of many First Nations organizations that were established through a mandate received by Chiefs in Assembly. Our organization was incorporated in 2014. And initially, the spirit name that we were given as an organization, we were called Nanandawewagamik, which means the healing place. Our official name is the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba. So since then, we've been operating since 2014 as a standalone entity. Going back to what one of our leaders had always reminded us is that as Indigenous people, we've always done research. We've always searched for understanding ways of being and knowing the world around us in order to survive. We just didn't call it research. That was Chief Norman Bone of Kisikowanan. And he wasn't always a believer in research. He was actually quite critical of research just because of the way research has been undertaken in the past. But since he's been on, he's guided some of the work that we've done since that time, and he understands and I guess has always known that we've always done research as Indigenous people. Otherwise, as he stated, how are we to survive up until now without it? And our elders have always reminded us that research is a relationship based on respect, and it takes time to build trust. And that's why we're also really careful with the way we undertake research, the way we engage our partnering communities, because we know how fragile that relationship is because of the way research has been done in the past, because of the way our people have been experimented on without consent. Some of the ways that I'll be sharing today of how we've been able to share our stories and tell our own stories through data is supporting nations in developing their own research ethics boards, building our own First Nations research centers, developing our own surveys based on the strengths and wellness of our nations that we know to be true. Developing our own nation-based indicators of well-being. So looking at shifting the way we measure things, how we want to be able to measure our wellness, not only focusing on our illness. We want to be able to repatriate existing data sets and to correct existing data sets, because oftentimes some of the data sets that exist currently don't capture what's needed to measure our wellness, or they're capturing the data, they're collecting the data wrong, which means the outcomes are going to be wrong. And that negative portrayal of our nations will continue as long as those data sets continue to be used, and to be able to create our own surveillance initiatives according to our own needs and priorities. So back in the 1990s, around the same time that the OCAP report was released, the Chiefs in Assembly created this entity. Well, not entity, it was a committee. Still continues to be a committee, but it was called the Health Information Research Governance Committee. and they were mandated essentially as a research ethics board to oversee the first iteration of the regional health survey. And they've overseen the regional health survey since that initial pilot phase back in the 1990s and continues to this day. They've expanded their mandate to now review all First Nations or all research involving First Nations research at a regional level as well. And then in 2007, AMC also included some of those requirements into their constitution, so that research must be done with First Nations, must abide by free, prior, informed consent on an individual and collective basis, that the First Nations principles of OCAP be followed, as well as First Nations ethical standards. When we talk about FPIC, or free, prior, informed consent, it really comes from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 19, where as nations, we must be able to provide or any type of engagement with the states or governments need to engage with First Nations or Indigenous people in order to secure and obtain free, prior, informed consent before any type of initiative that affects them or their within their territories. And this is incredibly important as it applies to research, because oftentimes what we've seen in the past, and this is how harms are implemented, or how harms are afflicted upon Indigenous people, is when consent is not provided, where nations are not informed about the risks involved with any type of research. And those are some of the types of harms that First Nations have experienced within those schools, within those hospitals, within those sanatoriums. This is why FPIC has become, why HERC has included FPIC as one of their requirements for research to be undertaken. I won't go through too much around the First Nations principles of OCAP, but just the main thing, it's the First Nations principles of OCAP. Oftentimes it's seen as a barrier to research. It is not a barrier. It offers First Nations the ability to determine for themselves how they engage in research, how they manage their information, where their information is held, who has access to it. And essentially, they maintain that ownership over their information, regardless of how it's shared and in the manner that it's shared. And really, it supports that self-determination for First Nations themselves to lead the research according to their own understanding, and as also to support their own needs and priorities. So that's not necessarily only coming from the perspective of the researcher, it's really coming from the perspective of the nations themselves. I talked earlier about how there's 5 distinct nations within Manitoba. And because there are 5 distinct nations, they don't necessarily have all the same protocols, cultural protocols to that guide their everyday lives. So it's important to actually build those relationships when you're engaging in any type of research project or initiative. It's important to get to know the people that you're going to be partnering with. And it goes back to what the elders had said, is that research is a relationship that's based on respect, and it takes time to build that trust. It doesn't happen overnight. When our First Nations REB HERC was established, Essentially, they provide that governance over all research within Manitoba. And they have that mandate to provide oversight at a regional level. Research that requests and data access requests that come at a regional level, not necessarily an individual First Nations research project or a data access request at an individual First Nation, because HERC would never overstep the sovereignty of an individual nation. That sovereignty always rests with the nations themselves. So it's important to, again, get that consent and create that relationship with the nations themselves if you are looking to do a First Nation specific research initiative. So essentially, PERC would really provide that guidance, not necessarily provide approval over individual nation-based research projects. They would provide review at the regional level. So if it was inclusive of all 63 First Nations or inclusive of a northern specific research project or a southern project. Over the past 20 years, this committee has supported over 150 different research projects. One of the biggest critiques of the committee or of research that the committee has seen is that most research projects come with full funding already. They come with a conditional or full REB approval from the institution themselves. So even before, and then they would come to the committee asking for partnership with community A, B, or C. And that's actually a real step backwards. So it means that the researcher would come with a fully funded proposal that had ethics approval and then was now looking for a partner. So it was a research project that was developed completely outside of any type of partnership with First Nations. So together, we've supported HERC to really reverse this process and really working towards supporting nations themselves in building their own research ethics boards. So right now we're working with the Anishinaabe at Four Arrows Health Authority to create their own Anishinaabe REB. So we're working with them to create their research policies and their protocols and supporting them with templates. And so we're really, really happy to see that occurring and to see the interest and the ability of the nations themselves kind of start taking on that responsibility. One of the biggest challenges that we find with research is oftentimes we see these pan-Indigenous approaches. And when I say pan-Indigenous, it's when we see research utilizing the term Indigenous, because I'm not Indigenous. I'm Nehiyawak. Helen is Anishinaabe. And I'm not Métis, I'm not Inuit. And when we utilize the term Indigenous, oftentimes it clumps the three nations together. And once you start doing that, once you start combining data sets, it's really hard for us to disaggregate or to even utilize that data to advocate for change or to advocate for further programs and services. It also continues to really measure our well-being against illness indicators that have been already predetermined. And it really does hide our unique realities and histories as it applies to our nations. It doesn't take into account sorry, I'm also calling from my vehicle. So really it does because we have different jurisdictions between on and off reserve, between urban and rural settings, when we utilize the terms Indigenous, it really hides those challenges and realities that our nations and families have to face on an everyday basis. And essentially, what currently exists, the data that currently exists, doesn't necessarily share or showcase who we are as Anishinaabe, as Nehewak, as Dene Dakota. It really does measure how assimilated we are into the larger Canadian society. So when you start collecting information, when you're starting to look at information, really pause to think about that, about how, where your partners are and how they see themselves within the, the existing data set that you're utilizing. And if you can't see them in there, then that's not their story. You're telling a different story about who they are. And you're contributing to sometimes negative stereotypes about who they are. So going back to one of the other ways that we've been able to tell our own stories through data, one of the biggest challenges is building the infrastructure to be able to house and hold your own data sets. It's one thing to utilize data sets, but until you actually physically possess your own data, there's also that risk of misuse when your data is held elsewhere. So we worked hard to create the infrastructure. Back in 2010, we created our own First Nations data center where we started to repatriate certain data sets. It took us about 2 years to repatriate the regional health survey data from the University of Manitoba. Even though we had a strong partnership at the time with the university, once your data is held by another institution, it becomes really difficult to repatriate that data. And unless you have a strong ISA in the beginning, an information sharing agreement, which kind of outlines how that information is utilized, how it's governed, how it's repatriated, and how it's protected, it becomes really challenging to repatriate that data. So now we have this data center currently housed at our organization at Finisum. We also we store information there that some of our own research projects that we've led, but we've also created space within that server to store additional First Nations data sets based on request. So rather than having the default always having the institution house and hold their data, we offer that space to communities. So if communities need space to store their own data, they don't necessarily want it to be held by an institution. Communities always have the option of storing it with us, again, through an ISA where that information continues to be governed by themselves. Not going to talk too much about the RHS. Kind of goes hand in hand with the OCAP. Essentially, it's the very first First Nations led survey that's been collected nationally across Canada as a result of First Nations being excluded from 3 national surveys. Previous to that, it's one of the only on reserve First Nations led surveys that's been designed, developed, and implemented by First Nations across Canada. It's kind of like our foundational survey that's kind of provided that foundation for the principles of OCAP to be created. And the framework that's utilized for implementing this survey, it really follows those principles and ensures First Nations have ownership, control, and access to that information. um, one really beautiful, uh, one really beautiful um, project that we've been. Okay, maybe I'm not meant to show that one, but I'll talk about it. We've partnered with the Blackfoot Confederacy. Maybe about 4 years ago, we wanted to. Um, there was a call that came out from the Canadian Institute for Health Research, CIHR, one of the major funders of health research right across Canada. There was a call that was put out. Um, they wanted to. They wanted. It was a call specific to diabetes, but we also didn't want to submit another proposal that really focused on diabetes. We want to kind of do more prevention and talk about an intervention more than anything. How do we start supporting our families and our babies to um, have a good life right from the beginning so that they will never present with diabetes? So then we went back to our knowledge keepers, and our knowledge keepers said, you need to go back to the beginning. And when some of the women, Kathleen Blue Sky, Jolene Mercer, Stephanie Sinclair, they started doing this birth work as an intervention. So we want to be able to really go back to create space for our families to repatriate our birthing practices, because at one point we were all born in our territories, in our home territories. It wasn't until maybe about, I'm not going to say my, not going to mention years, but for my family, I'm the first generation of my family to be born in a hospital. My parents, their generation, my aunties and uncles, their birth certificates, they say Thunderchild First Nation. My birth certificate says Turtleford, Saskatchewan, which was the nearest hospital. It wasn't until recently where we started um, being born in hospitals, where our birthing practices were seen more of an illness rather than a celebration of life. So what we want to do, we want to focus on creating a pathway to bring birthing back to our communities. And one of the ways we also worked with our families was to develop their own nation-based indicators of well-being, which is some of and when I talked about developing our own indicators of well-being, that is the exact work that we were doing. So talked about specific indicators that the nations themselves want to measure, and they were very different from the TRC call to action number 19, where it was measuring all those deficit indicators. So it was really different. So we're really honored to be able to do that work. So right now the communities are looking at ways to collect that data in order to measure those indicators of well-being. Moving to this slide, we also talked about data repatriation, and I talked about why it was important to repatriate our data, but also to correct those data sets. Because again, if your data that you're utilizing and analyzing is incorrect, your analysis is going to be incorrect and your recommendations are going to be incorrect. So being able to repatriate data for the purposes of advocacy and policy and systems change, we need to be able to repatriate and correct existing data sets. One of the ways that we've also been able to tell our own story is through linking data sets. And the way we've linked data sets to be able to be seen within data sets is through linking to the Indian Status Registry file. Now, if you're not aware, every single status First Nations, I'm going to say Indian for the purposes of this presentation, we're all registered with the Indigenous Services Canada, formerly known as INAC, or they had various iterations of their name. But essentially, there's a big department that's located in Ottawa. And every time a First Nations status child is born, they're also registered with ISC, Indian Services Canada. So that list includes all status First Nations people across Canada. And in order for us to, I guess, identify First Nations within Manitoba, we had to apply for access to that list, which we did. We also did it through information sharing agreements once again. And then that's how we were able to pull out, we linked the IRS file to the FIN numbers of all Manitobans, and then we're able to pull out all First Nations. Once we're able to pull out all First Nations, we're able to do some further analysis. One of the very first analysis that we did with that file was we created the health status of an access to healthcare by registered First Nations in Manitoba. And that was done in partnership with the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy. And that was the second iteration of that report. The very first iteration of that report was in 2009, 2010. And as I said earlier, in most of the analysis, First Nations had a greater, they're much higher than all other Manitobans within that report. You can access any of those reports online. We also utilize that IRS file to link once again to health administrative data sets, where we created community-based health profiles where every single community got a profile for their nation, kind of detailing what their overall health and well-being was. We also created a type 2 diabetes report within Manitoba. We had an individual chapter, again, in partnership with the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy. We also did a specific report based on the health and well-being of our children. And then the most recent one, well, actually, I shouldn't say the most recent one. We also utilized data linkages to identify how COVID was impacting our nations. That was the first time we were actually utilizing live data to track the spread of COVID amongst our people within Manitoba. And this was very significant because we've seen our First Nations organizations come together under one umbrella. So together, along with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, the Manitoba Giwatnao Okamaganuk, our organization, and KIM, the health arm of MKO, we came together to form the Manitoba First Nations Pandemic Response and Coordination Team. And based on some of the work that we did within that team, and this is why I guess this was so significant, it changed the way that we responded during the pandemic. We came at it with a First Nations-led response. Within research, I work closely with the First Nations COVID-19 Data Working Group, which brought together members of our First Nations REB, the HERC Committee, members of our organization, we brought together the EPI unit from the Manitoba Health, the province. We also work closely with the NIB and Angavasun at the U of M. And what we're able to do, and this is the first time we actually did this, we started collecting data where First Nations themselves would be able to voluntarily self-declare themselves as First Nation status, non-status Inuit or Métis. We also started linking based on familial relations. So if an individual had a sibling or a child, because they may not necessarily be found within that Indian status registry because of various reasons. One being the ISK office being closed for how many years within Manitoba. Not being able to register your child, or due to a number of different challenges in being able to register your child as status First Nations. So we started pulling in all those unregistered children and siblings. We pulled them into the report, and then started linking data. And then based on that, oh, one more thing, we're actually able to negotiate the first information sharing agreement with the province within 1 month. And I don't know how familiar any of you are with negotiations with any type of entity. The legal review process I've had, which sometimes takes 6 months to 3 years in terms of negotiating an ISA that meets the legal requirements or liabilities to both entities. During COVID, we were able to successfully negotiate an ISA within 1 month of starting those negotiations, which is unprecedented. And it was also an OCAP compliant ISA. And then some of the outcomes of those reports, what we were able to see within the data sets. We were able to see how COVID-19 was impacting First Nations differently, particularly our First Nations relatives living in Winnipeg or urban settings. We're seeing that First Nations were making up a higher proportion of hospitalizations and casualties from COVID-19. At various tables, we were able to share this information based on our own leadership, based on our own First Nations experts. We were able to share the information, and we were able to change the way First Nations were accessing the vaccine. We are actually bumped up in terms of some of those priority groups, and that was based on linking data, based on having control over our own information and being in control of the messaging. So when we think about going back to those indicators, this is something that we always question and have conversation about. Do we have the correct indicators or those right measurements? Are we tracking those indicators that are truly culturally relevant? Or are we measuring our own assimilation into Canadian society? Are we moving further away from who we were meant to be? Are we living that life that we were intended for as the original people within our territories? Are we living the life our ancestors have prayed for us? And with that, I'd like to thank you, each and every one of you, for your time. And I'll just open it up for questions. I know we don't have much time either.
Which is okay. But first of all, I want to thank you for your time and for coming to speak to us today. What a wealth of information. I'm sure a great deal of it that many people have never heard before. So thank you so much for that. No, we don't have a lot of time, but if there is a question in the next couple of minutes, also, if Leona wants to put her email in the chat, perhaps that would be a solution that if anyone had a question, they could contact you personally. Would that be okay with you, Leona? Okay, awesome. And we got 1 minute. So if you would like, if there is anybody who has a question, please speak up and just let us know who you are and where you're from. Otherwise, we'll just let Leona give us. There we go. Oh, great. So she's put her um, email address in there for anybody who has questions. And just a reminder to everyone, this has all been recorded, and so have the previous speakers been recorded. So those will be sent out to you if you didn't get a chance to participate. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone for coming today, especially our grandmothers, our huge contingent from Winnipeg today, Manitoba, very well represented. So thank you so much, Leona. And I hope you weren't driving doing that whole thing. I'm pretty sure.